Chapter 11 Look on My Works, Ye Mighty. This chapter mainly revolves around Dan, Rorschach, and Veidt. Dan and Rorschach venture to Karnak, where Veidt's vivarium is, in hopes of putting a stop to Veidt's doomsday plan. Obviously, Veidt drops an alien-like creature on New York City, and about 3 million people die, so Dan and Rorschach were unsuccessful. Prior to the catastrophe in New York City, we see many different couples experiencing relationship problems on the streets. As for the chapter title, Look on My Works, Ye Mighty, it comes from Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, in despair. Ozymandias was a Greek name for the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II. The chapter title omits despair, which shows the peace is created by a lie, and the peace conceals the despair. In ancient Egypt, one of the roles of the pharaoh was as an intermediary between the gods and the people. The pharaoh thus deputized for the gods. His role was both as civil and religious administrator. Adrian's hero name, Ozymandias, show his ambition to become godlike. Now let's take a look at Adrian Veidt's ambition to be a god. The destruction of Adrian Veidt's vivarium foreshadows the future destruction of many parts of the world. The creation of his vivarium shows how Adrian challenges the law of nature. In the second panel on page 7, he says, "Might I not celebrate the fortunes that have made this vivarium possible?" A miraculous bubble of Tropicana set into endless sub-zero waste. In the 6th panel on page 5, when Adrian presses the button to destroy the cities, the blue light makes him look like Dr. Manhattan, who is also referenced as God. Adrian believes that the destruction is a necessary evil for the greater good, and he has the right to kill hundreds of millions of people in order to preserve the peace. However, human beings are different from God, and Adrian can never become a god, although he is the smartest and most godlike person in the world. In chapter 12, page 18, in panel 4, Dr. Manhattan says that the world's smartest man means no more than does its smartest termite. Also, Adrian Veidt idolizes Alexander the Great. Paintings of Alexander the Great in Veidt's house, which are shown many times on page 4, panel 4, and page 15, panel 4, and the museum he visited in his youth, which is shown on page 8 and panel 6, show that Alexander has blonde hair, but Alexander the Great actually has dark or brown hair. In the paintings, Alexander and Adrian have very similar facial features, which shows the idolization that Adrian has for Alexander and sees himself as the new Alexander in his world. As for symbolism in this chapter, there's a whole lot. First, let's look at the shape of the hole in the snow, which appears on the chapter page as well as the second panel on the first page. And the shape of this matches the blood spatter on the comedian's badge, and the 12th panel on page 28 echoes this shape. Second, connections between Adrian Veidt and the captain in the Tales of the Black Freighter. The captain attempted to save the town, but killed his own wife. Adrian Veidt intended to save the planet from nuclear war by murdering hundreds of millions of innocent people. Adrian, who was killing the comedian in the second panel on page 26, looks like the captain, who is killing his wife, in the 4th panel on page 6. Next, let's look at the butterfly that appears many times in this chapter, almost a dozen times in color. I think that the butterfly stands for Rorschach because Rorschach lives in solitude for most of the time. He's very fragile, and he's unable to adapt to his new world, as well as the butterfly when it gets out of the vivarium, which they both end up dying because of it. Another connection between the butterfly and this chapter could also be that the Earth is surrounded by the cold of space and is easily destroyed, which, once again, the butterfly is easily destroyed after it escapes the vivarium. Moving on to the written excerpt after the chapter closes, we see that it's titled After the Masquerade, and a masquerade is a false show or a pretense. We see that Veidt has been referring to Nixon's close subordinates as humanoids. However, he probably sees all other people as humanoids as well. We see Veidt's opinion on the comedian. Veidt says he and the comedian are not good friends because of their political differences. He also says the comedian sees him as an intellectual dilettante, dabbling in national affairs, and he sees the comedian as an immoral, mercenary, allying himself to whichever political faction seems likely to grant him the greatest license. We also see Veidt's opinion on Dr. Manhattan. When Nova asks him how does he get to be a superhero, he answers, "You get to be a superhero by believing in the hero within you and summoning him or her forth by an act of will." After answering the question, he jokes about the way John, Dr. Manhattan, got his power. It shows that Veidt does not trust Dr. Manhattan. Alright, so now we're going to be going page by page, panel by panel, looking at all the references that appear in this chapter. So first, we're going to start on the first page, the second panel. This is a reference to Naked Lunch by William S. Burroughs and his cut-up technique, which is explained in the panel. We're going to move on to the third page and the third panel, and the candy that Rorschach is eating, which is called Sweet Chariot, is what he took from Dan's apartment in chapter 8, on page 22 in the third panel. Moving on to the fourth page and the fifth panel, we see that the tape reels resemble the radiation symbol, and the radiation symbol will reappear later, about 4 or 5 times within the chapter. Moving on to the sixth page in the first panel, the man is mad about the Pale Horse concert that is going on in Madison Square Garden, and in the Bible, the Pale Horse is a horse that is ridden by death. In the novel, it is a band, but that's kind of a ironic connection, is that it's ridden by death. On that same page in the seventh panel, we see a Gordian knot truck, and so the Gordian knot is associated with Alexander the Great, and it's often used as a metaphor for an intractable problem, like untying an impossibly tangled knot that is solved easily by finding an approach to the problem that renders the perceived constraints of the problem moot. Kind of dumbing that down, it means that you find a almost impossible problem and you kind of think outside of the box to solve it. You don't really follow the rules, but you do end up solving the problem. Moving on to the ninth page in the second panel, we see that guppies is a slang term, and it's also a slur for gay urban professionals, and it's kind of an allusion to the word yuppie, which was used in the 80s. It wasn't really a slur, but it meant a young person with a well-paid job and a fashionable lifestyle. Staying on that same page in the seventh panel, we see a book being given that is called Knots by R.D. Laing, published in 1970, and it is an actual book relating to relationship problems. Moving on to the next page in the second panel, we're talking about the Gordian knot again, and how Veidt could possibly own the Gordian knot lock company. Staying on the topic of Veidt, moving to the next page in the fifth panel, the logo suggests that Veidt owns Pyramid Deliveries, and he possibly owns the ship that appears in chapter 10 and possibly Nova Express too. We haven't seen this logo before, and it's the first time that it comes up, and it's pretty interesting. Moving on to the next page, we see a whole lot of white fields, which appear at the beginning of the chapter and the end of the chapter. It's kind of a common motif within this chapter. Moving on to the next page, in the second panel is the exact same as the ninth page, the sixth panel, but it's just from a different angle. Page 15, panel 4, you can look at the clocks and you see that the plots in New York and Karnak are moving at different paces. Moving on to the 20th page, the showing of The Day the Earth Stood Still is in theaters at the Utopia, and the 1950s film contains a strong anti-war message, which is very ironic. Moving to the 23rd page, panels 2 through 6 very closely mirror page 20. Moving on to the final page, page 28, final panel 13, we see just a white field, which is, we start this chapter and end this chapter with this white field, so it's a very common motif that we see throughout this chapter.